I'd like to comment on a video from Frank Turek, and he runs this website called crossexamined.org. And the question is asked, why should we support Israel if they reject Jesus? Now, this is obviously a question from a Christian perspective because they're concerned about, Christ and people receiving Christ, and why should we feel like the Jewish nation is somehow a special ally or a special group with, the U.S., who traditionally would be considered a Christian nation. Why would we support them if they reject Jesus? Now, I know that has a lot of political overtones and such, and we'll comment on that as we see how he responds to this question, and then hopefully we'll make the point that we want to make with this video.
So I was just wondering, because I've heard a lot of it recently, especially with like the wars that are going on, about the Israel we have today that was declared in May 14th, 1948 as a country isn't the same Israel that God prophesied in the Bible. I was just wondering, what's your viewpoint on that?
I would ask them, why do they say that?
See, that's
when they make a claim, it's not your job to refute the claim, it's their job to support the claim.
So he's asking, what difference does it make whether or not they are the same Jews as the Old Testament? And then he's saying, those who question that have the responsibility to, justify their claim that they're not the same people. And so, he's going to go on to make the point he believes they are the same ethnicity, the same people that can trace a lineage back to the Old Testament Jewish nation. But I would say here's the reason why it matters to Christians anyway. It's because we're wondering, is there some kind of a religious solidarity that we have with the Jewish nation when it comes to our feelings of brotherhood with the nation of Israel? If you're a Christian and you see that Israel is largely a secular state, many atheists in the country and those who are religious, by and large, reject Christ and are even hostile towards Jesus, then why should we feel like there's some kind of a brotherhood between us? And you always hear the phrases like Judeo-Christian values, as if to cram the two together as if we're really one. What we mean by Judeo-Christian, it's what I always meant, is that we're talking about biblical morality. But Christianity is the aim of all of the Bible. It is the aim of all of the Old Testament, was to get people to Christ in order to be saved by, his sacrifice. And so the Jewish religion has become obsolete as far as God is concerned. So that's why it matters, but it matters to Christians who are thinking on the religious spectrum. He's going to begin to talk about political considerations. And so that is a distinction I would like to comment on here in a moment.
Okay.
So why do you say?
I don't believe it, but I'm just confused on how the idea might have come up, because it's prophesied that Israel would be declared a nation, but then we have believers that are saying that the Israel we have today isn't the Israel that was prophesied in the Bible.
Yeah, so she's talking about the dispensational idea that Israel is still a nation of God, that God still has covenant relationship with Israel that he will continue to fulfill into the future and bring them ultimately to Christ and Christianity. But as it is, they are still God's people over there. And he's like, where does that come from, and why does that matter?
I think even if they were right, that wouldn't change the fact that given the current conflict between Hamas and between Israel, that we should be supporting Israel. This doesn't mean that everything Israel does is right.
Okay, so here he's now finally getting to it. He's basically saying even if they are right, meaning those who are correct about saying that Israel is not a special covenant people of God any longer because they reject Jesus, he's saying even if they are right, consider the current conflict between Israel and Hamas. And he's going to make the point that politically and maybe even morally, he is implying, we should support Israel because they are victims of violence and unjust attacks on their country. And so we should support them. That's a whole political discussion. And that's not something I feel qualified to muse about. I don't feel qualified to talk about political things in some authoritative way. I mean, I have opinions on all of these things, but they're not worth a nickel to you. My goal here and my aim on this channel is to talk about biblical revelation and biblical things. And so, the political question, the historical question is one thing, but the biblical question is another. And he is going to basically, in this video, he's going to make the case politically. So I think that he and I would agree overall with the concept that Israel is not God's special people any longer. In fact, he will start talking about their apostasy here in a moment, and that's going to make a further point that I want to comment on.
Even for those who say, well, we ought to bless Israel. Okay, well, what does bless mean? Does bless mean you always agree? No. You don't bless your kid by always agreeing with what they're doing, right?
The issue here, however, is it seems in this current political climate, if you do question Israel, if you do have a problem with the way that the government of Israel is responding to certain things, and you see certain attacks on women and children, and the extent to which Israel is destroying her enemies around her, then if you question that, these uber supporters of Israel just lose their minds, and all of a sudden you are a rabid Jew hater, an anti-Semite. And so, yeah, it is a problem just to question them. Now, Frank is saying there really shouldn't be a problem questioning Israel's tactics, even if we're their allies overall. We should be able to condemn what they're doing if they're doing something wrong or immoral. And so I agree with Frank on that, but unfortunately, not many of the people who support Israel that I've been familiar with feel the same way. People will say, well, it's not the same Israel as it was. Yeah, it's the same. They're apostate. So there we go. He's saying they're the same ethnically, they're the same nation, but religiously, they are apostate. They have left the Lord's will. And so I agree with him on that. They have not received Christ, and so therefore they are not in fellowship with God. They are not pleasing to God. They are no longer in covenant with God. The Israel that was taken out in 722 by the Assyrians was also apostate. Do you know in I think it's 19 kings in the northern kingdom of Israel, 0 of them were good kings. They were all apostate. And only a handful of the kings from Judah were good kings. So when people say, well, we ought not be supporting Israel at all because, they're not even Christians. Well, they weren't even following Yahweh in the Old Testament. That's what the Old Testament is about, right? It's kind of a strange point he's trying to make, or at least the way he's getting there. He's saying, even in the Old Testament, they were apostate, just like they were now. And so why should we be questioning whether or not we should support them? Would we support Israel in the Old Testament? Is that I don't understand his logic here. But, he's just trying to make the point that our determination on whether or not to support Israel should not be based upon some kind of biblical promise that God is still in a covenant with Israel over in the Middle East. So I think that's what he's trying to say here. But the point I would make from this is crucial. He's alluding to the Old Testament punishments of God's people by God himself for their apostasy. He alluded to the 722 deportation under Assyria. You could go to the next one also in 586 under Babylonian captivity. They were carried away from the land and punished for their idolatry. And then God even brought them back from that in the Old Testament record in order to rebuild and reestablish the nation for the purpose of bringing Jesus into the world to give them one final chance. That's the key. So when you open up the New Testament, you're seeing Jesus now coming into the world to give Israel one more chance by God's grace. He didn't have to give them another chance, but he gave them another chance because he wants to save them, and he sent his own son to them, and they rejected Jesus as a nation, as a whole. And so that's why God once again punished Israel in AD 70 by the Romans this time. And he destroyed their city, and he scattered their people away from the land one last time. That is the key here. So yeah, they're apostate, and that's why they were scattered from the land back in AD 70. Now, nobody denies that the nation state of Israel was reestablished in 1948, But that doesn't mean that you have to say, well, God did that. There are other explanations for why that happened. There are geopolitical maneuverings. There are the issue about World War II and things that followed that, a declaration before that, Balfour Declaration. There were, Zionists for, since the 1800s who were trying to get Israel a place to stay because they were scattered among the nations still. But none of that necessarily has to be traced to the Bible. And I would say from what I believe the Bible is saying is that this is not an act of God bringing them back to the nation as far as because he's still in covenant with them. It is the way geopolitical maneuverings happen. And so, again, the distinction to make here is between a political reason and a biblical reason. There may be political reasons to support Israel for this or that, and that's what I'm saying I don't comment on in any kind of an authoritative way. I have opinions, and they can be debated and so forth, but biblically, there is no justification for viewing Israel as somehow in a covenant relationship with God and therefore deserving of our support strictly because we believe God says so. That's just not the case. Let's continue.
About how evil they were. They're still evil now, but because we're all evil. But Hamas, these nations right now who are saying we want to recognize a Palestinian state, have they read the Hamas Charter? Have you read the Hamas Charter? Do you know what the Hamas Charter says? All of these conferences to come up with a two-state solution are a waste of time. They don't want a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution, no Israel. They're the new Nazi party.
So here he's going back to the political reasons why he would be a supporter of Israel. And so here's probably his strongest statement about supporting Israel and why we should, because their enemies are our enemies as well. Or, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so in other words, the common enemy is, Hamas here. It has to do with, Muslim extremism, Islamic State and things like this. And so he's saying we should support Israel because Hamas is even more evil. They want to wipe out Israel, and that is, of course, a Nazi sentiment, and so they're the new Nazis. So again, there is a political reason, but not a biblical justification for supporting Israel as if they are still covenant people of God. The only way you can say I have biblical reasons is just to appeal to biblical morality. What is the right thing to do? What is justice when it comes to international affairs? And then you can have that discussion. And then the next discussion would be is to what extent should America be involved in these foreign affairs whenever we need to be taking care of ourselves. I mean, that's what nations do. They have to maintain their own health and their own vibrancy in order to provide a platform for the people of their country, of their nation, to seek and serve God, the God of heaven. So that would be the way that the discussion progresses properly. There are moral principles that are timeless, but the question about whether Israel has a right to the land because God says so in the Bible is not a consideration any longer. He judged that nation for their rejection of Jesus, and now the political history of the world has moved on since AD 70. That's really what I wanted to talk about here and just make that distinction on this channel. I don't speak in any at length about my opinions about politics, but I do want to exegete the Scriptures. I want to study the story of the Scriptures and understand better how we should view world affairs through the lens of the Bible. And if that's the case, then we need to keep in mind that the whole dispensational idea, the whole biblical justification for supporting Israel in the Middle East today is simply a misreading of the text of Scripture.